CHAPTER XIV. Of the Vicar of Wrexhill. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. The Vicar of Wrexhill by Francis Milton Trollope. CHAPTER XIV. An Interview. The Lime Tree. Rosalind's Letter to Mr. Mowbray. At about 11 o'clock the following morning, Miss Torrington was informed that Mr. Cartwright requested to speak to her for a few minutes in the drawing room. Henrietta was with her when the message was delivered, and seemed to await her reply with some curiosity. "I will wait upon him immediately," was the civil and ready answer; and as Rosalind gave it, and at the same moment rose from her chair to obey the summons, she looked in the face of her companion to see if there were any wish expressed there that the silence so strictly enjoined should be broken. But Miss Cartwright was occupied by a volume of engravings which lay before her, and Rosalind left the room without having met her eye. It is impossible to imagine a demeanour or address more perfectly gentlemanlike and respectful than those of Mr. Cartwright as he walked across the room to receive Miss Torrington. Strong as her feelings were against him, this still produced some effect, and as she seated herself and motioned to him to do the same, her mental soliloquy amounted to this: "At any rate, I will listen patiently to what he has to say. I have taken the liberty of requesting to speak to you, Miss Torrington, because I felt persuaded that my conduct and principles have, from some accident, been misunderstood, and I cannot but hope that it may be in my power to explain them, so as in some degree to remove the prejudice which I fear you have conceived against me. It is my duty, sir, both as a matter of courtesy and justice, to hear whatever you wish to say in justification or excuse of the scene I witnessed yesterday morning. Miss Fanny Mowbray is not yet recovered from the effect of the agitation into which she was thrown by it, and I have no objection, Mr. Cartwright, to repeat to you in person my fixed determination not to continue in the house if that scene be repeated." "It is impossible," replied Mr. Cartwright, "to find a lady of your age so steadfast in adhering to what she believes to be right, without feeling both admiration and respect for her. And I should think, forgive me if I wound you, I should think that such a one cannot altogether condemn the offering of prayer and thanksgiving." "Mr. Cartwright," replied Rosalind, her colour rising and her voice expressive of great agitation, "you talk of having been misunderstood. But it is I, sir, who have reason to make this complaint. From which of my words, either written or spoken, do you presume to infer that I contemn the offering of prayer and thanksgiving?" "I beseech you to bear with me patiently," said Mr. Cartwright, with a look and tone of the most touching mildness, "and be assured that by doing so, we shall not only be more likely to make ourselves mutually understood, but finally to arrive at that truth which, I am willing to believe, is equally the object of both. And the theme, my dear young lady, on which we speak should never be alluded to, at least I think not, with any mixture of temper." Poor Rosalind, honest as her vehemence was, she felt that she had been wrong to show it, and with an effort that did her honour, she contrived to say, "You are quite right, sir. As far as manner is concerned, you have greatly the advantage of me by your self-possession and calmness. Herein I will endeavour to imitate you, and assure you, with a sang-froid as perfect as your own, that I consider the offering of prayer and thanksgiving as the first duty of a Christian. It is in consequence of the reverence in which I hold this sacred duty that I shrink from seeing it performed irreverently. I have been taught to believe, sir, that the deepest learning, the most deliberative wisdom, and the most grave and solemn meditation given to the subject by the fathers and founders of our church, were not too much to bestow on the sublime and awful attempt to address ourselves suitably to God in prayer. Prayers so framed and fitted for every exigency that human nature can know have been prepared for us with equal piety and wisdom, and while such exist, I will never join in any crude, unweighed, unauthorized jargon addressed to the Deity, however vehement the assumption of piety may be in the bold man who uses it." "It is seldom that so young a lady," replied the vicar with a kind and gentle smile, "can have found time to give this important question so much attention as you appear to have done. Yet perhaps, Miss Torrington, when a few years more of deep consideration have been given by you to the subject, you may be led to think that fervour of feeling may more than atone for imperfection in expression." "If you imagine, sir," replied Rosalind, in a voice as tranquil and deliberate as his own, "that I have dared to regulate my conduct and opinions on such a point as this by any wisdom of my own, you do me great injustice. Such conduct, if general, would make as many churches upon earth as there are audacious spirits who reject control. My father, Mr. Cartwright, was one whose life was passed in the situation which perhaps, beyond all others in the world, taught him the value of the establishment to which he belonged. To those of another and an adverse faith he was a kind friend and a generous benefactor. But he could not be insensible, nor did he leave me so, of the superior purity and moral efficiency of his own. And I hope not to live long enough to forget the reverence which he has left impressed upon my mind for all that our church holds sacred." "Not for worlds, my excellent young lady," exclaimed Mr. Cartwright with warmth, "would I attempt to shake opinions so evidently sustained by a sense of duty. Respect for such will assuredly prevent my again attempting to perform the office which offended your opinions this morning, as long as you continue, what you certainly ought to be at this time, the mistress of this family. I will only ask, Miss Torrington, in return for the sincere veneration I feel for your conscientious scruples, that you will judge me with equal candour, and will believe that however we may differ in judgment, I am not less anxious to be right than yourself." Rosalind answered this appeal by a silent bow. "May I then hope that we are friends?" said he, rising and presenting his hand, "and that I may venture to call, as I promised Mrs. Mowbray I would do, on yourself, Miss Fanny, and my daughter, without driving you from the house?" "Certainly, sir," was Rosalind's cold reply. The request appeared as reasonable in itself as it was politely and respectfully made, and to refuse it would have been equally churlish, presumptuous, and unjust. Nevertheless, there was something at the bottom of her heart that revolted against the act of shaking hands with him, and feigning to be occupied by arranging some flowers on the table, she suffered the offered hand to remain extended, till at length its patient owner withdrew it. Though well pleased that her remonstrance had put a stop to the vicar's extempore prayings at the house, Rosalind was not altogether satisfied by the result of the interview. "We are still upon infinitely too civil terms," thought she; "but I see that just at present it would be an Herculean labour to quarrel with him. If I smite him on one cheek, he will turn himself about as unresistingly as a sucking pig upon the spit, and submit to be basted all round without uttering a single squeak. But when Mrs. Mowbray returns, I suspect that it will be my turn to be basted. N'importe. I am sure I have done no more than my father would have thought right." With this consolation she returned to her dressing room, and applied herself to her usual occupations. Henrietta was no longer there, but as the fashion of the house was for every one to find employment and amusement for themselves during the morning, she did not think it necessary to pursue her in order to prove her wish to be agreeable. At luncheon the three young ladies met as usual in the dining room. Fanny appeared to have recovered her spirits and good humour, and Henrietta seemed to wish to be more conversable than usual. They then strolled into the gardens, visited the hothouses, and finally placed themselves in a shady and fragrant bower, where they discoursed of poetry and music for an hour or two. When these subjects seemed to be well nigh exhausted, Miss Cartwright rose and slowly walked towards the house without intimating to her companions what it was her purpose to do next. Rosalind and Fanny being thus left tête à tête, the former said, "What do you think of our new acquaintance, Fanny? How do you like Miss Cartwright?" "I do not think she seems at all an amiable girl," replied Fanny. "With such advantages as she has, it is quite astonishing that her manners are so little agreeable." "She is not remarkably conversable, certainly," said Rosalind; "but I suspect that she has very bad health. How dreadfully sallow she is!" "I suspect that she has a worse infirmity than bad health," answered Fanny. "She has, I fear, an extremely bad temper." "She has not a violent temper at any rate," observed Rosalind; "for I never remember to have seen any one who gave me greater idea of being subdued and spirit broken." "That is not at all the impression she makes upon me," said Fanny. "I should call her rather sullen than gentle, and obstinate instead of subdued. But this gossiping is sad idle work, Rosalind. As Miss Henrietta has fortunately taken herself off, I may go on with what I was doing before luncheon." Late in the evening Mr. Cartwright and his son Jacob paid the young ladies a visit. The vicar's conversation was chiefly addressed to Miss Torrington, and if she had never seen him before, she must have agreed with Fanny in thinking him one of the most agreeable persons in the world, for he spoke fluently and well upon every subject, and with a person and voice calculated to please every eye and every ear. There were probably indeed but few who could retain as steady a dislike to him as our Rosalind did. The young man got hold of a purse that Fanny was netting, and did his best to entangle her silks; but his chief amusement was derived from attempts to quiz and plague his sister, who treated him much as a large and powerful dog does a little one, enduring his gambols and annoying tricks with imperturbable patience for a while, and then suddenly putting forth a heavy paw and driving him off in an instant. The following day passed very nearly in the same manner, excepting that the three girls separated immediately after breakfast, and did not meet again until luncheon time. On the third, Fanny was the first to leave the breakfast room, and Miss Cartwright and Rosalind being left together, the former said, "I suppose we owe our repose from morning and evening ranting to you, Miss Torrington." "I certainly did not approve it, Miss Cartwright, and I took the liberty of telling your father so." "You were undoubtedly very right and very wise, and I dare say you feel some inward satisfaction at your success. Mr. Cartwright has really shown great deference to your opinion by so immediately abandoning, at your request, so very favourite an occupation." Rosalind was about to reply, when Miss Cartwright changed the conversation by abruptly saying, "Will you take a stroll with me this morning, Miss Torrington?" "Yes, certainly, if you wish it; but I think we shall find it very warm." "Oh, no! I will lead you to a very nice shady walk to the prettiest and most sheltered little thicket in the world. Let us put on our bonnets directly, shall we?" "I will not delay you a moment," said Rosalind. "Shall I ask Fanny to go with us?" "Why, no," replied Miss Cartwright. "I think you had better not. The chances are 10 to 1 against her finding it convenient. You know she is so fond of solitary study." "I believe you are right," said Rosalind; and the young ladies parted, to meet again a few minutes after, with bonnets and parasols, at the hall door. "And which way are we to go to find this welcome shade?" said Rosalind, holding her parasol low down to shelter her pretty face. "The sun is almost intolerable." "This way," said Henrietta, turning aside from the driveway in a direction which soon brought them to a thickly planted ride that surrounded the park. "We shall find it delightful here." It was an hour which, in the month of July, few ladies would choose for walking; but Miss Torrington politely exerted herself to converse, though she secretly longed to be lying silent and alone on the sofa in her own dressing room, with no greater exertion than was necessary for the perusal of the dear pages of some new romance. Henrietta, however, only answered her dryly and shortly, and presently said, "I should be really very much obliged to you, Miss Torrington, if you would not speak to me any more. Just listen to the blackbirds, will you? Depend upon it, we can neither of us express ourselves one half so well as they do." Rosalind willingly submitted to this request, and the young ladies walked onward, producing no other sound than the occasional brushing of their dresses against the underwood, which at every step became thicker, rendering the path almost too narrow for two to walk abreast. "Now let us just turn down through this little opening," said Henrietta in a whisper, "and pray do not speak to me." Rosalind, who began to believe that she must have some meaning for her strange manner of proceeding, followed her in perfect silence, and they had not gone far into the intricacies of the tangled copse before she heard the sound of a human voice at no great distance from her. Henrietta, who was in advance, turned round and laid her finger on her lips. The caution was not needed. Rosalind had already recognised the tones of Mr. Cartwright, and a few more silent steps brought them to a spot thickly surrounded on all sides, but from whence they could look out upon a small and beautiful opening, in the centre of which a majestic lime tree stretched its arms in all directions over the soft green turf. Rosalind instantly recognised the spot as one frequently resorted to in their evening rambles, for the sake of its cool and secluded beauty, and also because a bench, dividing into commodious stalls, surrounded the capacious tree, from whence opened a vista commanding a charming view across the park. On the turf before this bench, and with their backs turned toward the spot where Rosalind and Henrietta stood, knelt Mr. Cartwright and Fanny. His eyes were fixed upon her with passionate admiration, and the first words they distinctly heard were these, spoken with great vehemence by the vicar: "Persecuted, trampled on, turned forth from every other roof, let thy blue vault spread over us, and while I struggle to snatch this precious brand from the eternal fire of thy wrath, pour upon our heads the dew of thy love. Grant me power to save this one dear soul alive, though it should seem good in thy sight that millions should perish around her. Save her from the eternal flame that even now rises to lick her feet, and if not stayed by prayer, the prayer of thy saints will speedily envelop and consume her." Rosalind remained to hear no more. Heartsick, indignant, disgusted, and almost terrified by what she saw and heard, she retreated hastily, and followed by Henrietta, rapidly pursued her way to the house. Her companion made an effort to overtake her, and almost out of breath by an exertion to which she was hardly equal, she said, I have shown you this, Miss Torrington, for the sake of giving you a useful lesson. If you are wise, you will profit by it, and learn to know that it is not always safe to suppose you have produced an effect, merely because it may be worth some one's while to persuade you into believing it. Having said thus much to point the moral of our walk in the sun, you may go your way, and I will go mine. I shall not enter upon any more elaborate exposition of Mr. Cartwright's character." So saying, she fell back among the bushes, and Rosalind reached the house alone. On entering her dressing room, Miss Torrington sat herself down, with her eau de cologne bottle in one hand and a large feather fan in the other, to meditate, coolly if she could, but at any rate to meditate, upon what she ought to do in order immediately to put a stop to the very objectionable influence which Mr. Cartwright appeared to exercise over the mind of Fanny. Had she been aware of Sir Gilbert Harrington's having written to recall his refusal of the executorship, she would immediately have had recourse to him; but this fact had never transpired beyond Mrs. Mowbray and the vicar, and the idea that he had resisted the representation which she felt sure his son had made to him after the conversation Helen and herself had held with him, not only made her too angry to attempt any farther to soften him, but naturally impressed her with the belief that, do or say what she would on the subject, it must be in vain. At length it struck her that Charles Mowbray was the most proper person to whom she could address herself. Yet the writing such a letter as might immediately bring him home was a measure which, under all existing circumstances, she felt to be awkward and disagreeable. But the more she meditated, the more she felt convinced that, notwithstanding the obvious objections to it, this was the safest course she could pursue. So having once made up her mind upon the subject, she set about it without farther delay, and, with the straightforward frankness and sincerity of her character, produced the following epistle. "Dear Mr. Mowbray, your last letter to Helen, giving so very agreeable an account of the style and manner of your little go, makes it an ingracious task to interrupt your studies, and yet that is what I am bent upon doing. You will be rather puzzled, I suspect, at finding me assuming the rights and privileges of a correspondent, and moreover of an adviser, or rather a dictator, but so it is, and you must not blame me till you are quite sure you know all my reasons for it. Mrs. Mowbray is gone to London, accompanied by Helen, for the purpose of proving, I think it is called, your father's will, a business in which Sir Gilbert Harrington has most unkindly for all of you refused to join her. This journey was so suddenly decided upon, that dear Helen had no time to write to you about it. She knew not she was to go till about 9 o'clock the evening preceding. The Vicar of Wrexhill was probably acquainted with the intended movement earlier, for no day passes, or has passed for some weeks, without his holding a private consultation with your mother. Oh, that vicar, Charles! I think I told you that I hated him, and you seemed to smile at my hatred as a sort of missish impertinence and caprice. But what was instinct then has become reason now, and I am strangely mistaken if your hatred would not fully keep pace with mine, had you seen and heard what I have done. When I decided upon writing to you, I intended, I believe, to enter into all particulars, but I cannot do this. You must see for yourself and draw your own inferences. My dislike for this man may carry me too far, and you must be much more capable of forming a judgment respecting his motives than I can be. Of this, however, I am quite sure. Fanny ought at this time to have some one near her more capable of protecting her from the mischievous influence of this hateful man than I am. I know, Mr. Charles, that you have no very exalted idea of my wisdom, and I am not without some fear that, instead of coming home immediately, as I think you ought to do, you may write me a very witty, clever answer, with reasons as plenty as blackberries, to prove that I am a goose. Do not do this, Mr. Mowbray. I do not think that you know me very well, but in common courtesy, you ought not to believe that any young lady would write you such a summons as this without having very serious reasons for it. As one proof of the rapidly increasing intimacy between the family of the vicar and your own, you will, on your arrival, find the daughter, Miss Cartwright, established here to console us for your mother's and Helen's absence. She is a very singular personage, but on her I pass no judgment, sincerely feeling that I am not competent to it. If my opinion be of sufficient weight to induce you to come, Mr. Mowbray, I must beg you to let your arrival appear the result of accident, and not to let any one but Helen know of this letter. Believe me very sincerely, your friend, Rosalind Torrington. End of chapter 14.